Hi, today I'm going to be reviewing a horror game called Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. I'm going to go through the main game, the endless mode, and a bit of the DLCs. I'm mostly going to be talking about the HD renovation, but I might occasionally talk about the original Game Maker version. This video will obviously contain lots of spoilers in this game, so if you haven't already, I'd recommend checking this game out for yourself. This game involves lots of walking, running, but also hiding, hitting, and being high. Chances are you already know how this game works, so let's talk about the mansion, which is pretty much the main game. In the first room, you get greeted by Spooky and you get a sensation that you might have to go through 1,000 rooms. After she's done with her introduction, she just flies into the ceiling and you go through the first rooms. When you're going through the first 60 rooms, the only specimen that attacks you is Specimen 1, which are those cardboard cutouts that spring out from the wall. Specimen 1 has a pretty lazy way to jump scare the player, yet it still scares most players because it is so unexpected. It also makes you feel stupid if you get jump scared by Specimen 1, since the design is mostly cute. I think this is a great introduction to the game, since the game isn't meant to be taken very seriously. But other than that, there's nothing in the first 60 rooms that can really attack you. I vividly remember when I first played the game blind, the ambiences were the scariest part. It sets you an expectation that something or someone is out there to get you, but nothing really happens, except, Specimen 1. And because nothing happens, the anticipation just keeps getting higher and higher. After around 30 rooms, I was wondering when anything was going to happen, which eventually made me wonder if anything was going to happen at all. That made me lure into a false sense of security, because nothing is happening and I thought nothing was going to happen for the entire game. Basically, the longer I played for, the safer I felt playing the game since nothing happened. That is, until I entered room 60. I saw a green ink in the middle of the room and a table that had a note on it. So I read the cool note that makes you read out a ritual and then spawns a green creature. So forget everything I said about the sense of security you get. I think it's a fine specimen to start this game really with. I like the design and the chase music of Specimen 2, which from now on I'll be calling as Ink Monster. And it does increase the shock factor, but after a few chases, it's not that scary anymore since it's very predictable, which seems to be the case for most specimens in this game. The difference between the OG and the HD version is that the OG Ink Monster can go through the walls, while the HD Ink Monster doesn't. Personally, this makes the OG Ink Monster harder, because when you enter a room where you have to turn a lot, you have to be careful and not to go too fast, or else the specimen will attack you through the walls. This will be a very reoccurring theme towards floating specimens, but Ink Monster isn't very fast and it's very hard for it to attack you, especially on the HD version, because it can't even attack you when you're moving on the ink that slows you down. In short, decent introduction and chase mechanic. Music is great, and as a starter specimen, it works. The Ink Monster chased me around 10 to 20 rooms, which is usually how long the other specimens last, so even if they rechase you, it's not that much of a problem. The next specimen is the giant centipede spider thing. I love the spawn room. It just felt abandoned and it threw me off guard because of the random environment change. You go through the rooms and oh no, one of them broke out, and then you have the funny note with the Spooky just flying into the ceiling once again, and you finally meet the specimen. First of all, can I just say how hilarious the difference between the OG and the HD version of the spider is? In the HD version, the spider has a terrifying animation where it crawls from the hole and chases you, and its speed constantly changes, which makes the chase slightly more interesting. I genuinely got chills when I first got chased by the HD version of the spider. And then we have the OG version of the spider, which you can tell it was made in Game Maker. It's basically an easier version of the Ink Monster without it going through the walls and having any mechanics other than it just spawning under the hole, which it barely even does a good job at. but the upgrade for the HD version was very much needed. I love the small attention to detail to when the spider attacks you, it runs away from you for a while. I like the music too. It's quite simple, but it works well with the specimen. The next specimen we meet is Specimen 4, aka Ringu. Her introduction is about being in an abandoned Japanese school. I've seen many people getting unsettled by this, but honestly it didn't unsettle me a lot. At least not as much as Spider's introduction room. I like the music that plays when she's chasing, which oddly enough has two versions. I've seen lots of people say that the old music is better than the one that's used right now. And this might be a hot take, but I think the current chase music is better. I don't know what it is that makes me think that way, but it feels oddly comforting and soothing. That is until I remember that there's a ghost woman chasing me. In hindsight, it's just a spookier and more buffed version of the Ink Monster. And no, we're not going to talk about the game over screen. Specimen 5 is a figure who reminds me of my dad because he always chased me and made me hallucinate the walls, which made me feel disorientated. Anyways, I kid you not, Specimen 5 in the game files is called Bab. My dad is also called Bab and he worked at a church and was in a cult. He died a few months ago. But Bab is one of my favorite specimens in the main game. The introduction rooms are great except for that one red room. Her effects did a great job in scaring me and the music is well made and fits so well with whatever the hell is happening with these walls. I felt very uncomfortable during my first time getting chased by Bab, probably because I had no fucking idea what was happening. She is kind of slow, which makes her less of a threat, but I still think this specimen is so terrifying. Specimen 6, which I will name him as Ben, is probably one of the most famous specimens in this game, most notably its game over screen. I'm not going to speak too much about the game over screens, but I've seen many playthroughs where they died to Ben first. Imagine the feeling you had when the first specimen you die to has a death screen where your eyes get poked out. I think the reason why most people die to Ben first is because you have to look at Ben directly and walk backwards. The game doesn't really give it away, which leads to confusion when you try to run away from Ben until you die. I was going to say that's one of the downsides of the specimen's introduction, but I wouldn't really mind it that much since you'll most likely have to go through only around 20-30 rooms. The music for Ben is probably one of the best personally. I love how it gets more distorted as the music progresses and it just sounds really great overall. Specimen 7 is quite an interesting one. The introduction seems harmless and it's basically a cat guiding you to therapy. Again, it seems harmless at first until you get to the tunnel of whatever this is, and then you get chased by Gygas himself. But what I find quite interesting is that the music is very calming and relaxing compared to what is happening in the game. There's not a lot of stuff for me to say about this specimen, which considering that it never chases again makes kind of sense. It's not a bad specimen by any means, it's just kind of forgettable. Oh dear god, it's the dear god, haha. This is another very known specimen for this game, which is fair because it has great music, great atmosphere, great design, a really unique introduction room that gives you an axe, and the deers that do something funny when you rapidly style swap between 2D and 3D textures. And luckily, the mechanic for the specimen has been revamped 3 years ago, which made the specimen more interesting but also scary. Originally, it just used to be another Ringer copy, so this revamp was very much needed. Also, is it normal that my friend is simping for the Duke God? The next specimen that I encountered was Specimen 10, aka the Worm Thing. As usual, the introduction to the specimen is great. The part where you crawl into a vent and the sounds happening inside are really scary even if nothing happens other than whatever that thing is. I like to think that they added that last node before you meet the specimen as a hint for how to survive the specimen because people never figured out how it works without searching it up. One of the things that the specimen has done an awesome job at is the music. The music feels so dreadful and slow, which fits the specimen so well because you don't really have a lot of choices other than to just watch the specimen walk slowly towards you for what feels like an eternity. While other specimen chase music's names are nonsense, this song is titled Getting There, which again fits so well for the specimen. The mechanic is unique, but it's not very great either. It's a break from all the running away from the specimens, but it also feels boring after you basically understood how the specimen work. And I don't like how the 600's rooms are purposely meant to be long for the specimen. It feels like the game is trying to drag the specimen for as long as possible. At least the design for the specimen is pretty cool, and at least it's better than the old Specimen 10. Next up we have Specimen 11, which I will name him as Food Demon. The introduction rooms are infamous for its 100% beef food posters, the person who used to work at this place, and the fun tube. I think the Food Demon has decent music and design, but honestly that's pretty much it. The mechanics are pretty much the same as Ringo. Yes, it does remove the door sometimes, but that doesn't really change a whole lot. I think the Food Demon is one of the more forgettable specimens. There's nothing really left for me to say about the specimen. Specimen 12, aka the Old Man, is probably the most different from the other specimens. It features a mansion where you have to hide in specific locations, which I think is a better approach for a break from getting chased by other specimens. It is pretty terrifying the first time you encounter the Old Man, but it does lose its scare factor pretty fast after you realize that the Old Man is practically blind. And after a few hiding sessions, he chases you with an axe. Again, nothing really that memorable other than the introduction moves. If it was just the main chase, it would be a pretty boring specimen. And now we have the final specimen, Specimen 13, or the Siren. If you're familiar with horror games, you'll immediately recognize that the Siren is inspired by the invisible water monster from the infamous horror game Amnesia. The introduction has a room where you can see the big whale, so it's automatically the best introduction. Jokes aside, I think it's decent as a specimen. It's fine as a final specimen, excluding the boss. But I don't like it as much as I used to before playing Endless Mode, because holy shit does she spawn so often in the Endless Mode. And as our final boss we have Specimen 2. What? And as our final boss we have I can't, I'll just imagine Specimen 2 being the final boss. And as our final boss we have Specimen 9, which is very convenient. Specimen 9 has two forms, the normal form and the boss form, and I'll talk about both. The normal form of Specimen 9 pretty much never spawns unless you go in the endless hallway or you go AFK for a minute. What I find really haunting about the specimen is the theme. It's so simple yet so effective. I saw a comment on a video which said if you listen to the music even when you're not playing the game, it feels like Specimen 9 is on its way to kill you or something, and I strongly agree with that. That aside, I think it's unfortunate that the specimen isn't a very big threat or it doesn't appear in the game very often. But man, I sure hope that the specimen doesn't have a very dark and fucked up story. I think the boss form is fine, it's in the middle for me, it works as a final boss, but what I realize why people like the specimen a lot is because of the story that the specimen has. Although I do understand why people would like the story elements of this game as a whole, and it does add a horror element, I don't think the story matters a whole lot to me. Now that we've talked about each specimen in the mansion, I'll talk about miscellaneous stuff that doesn't really have to do with the specimens or the mansion. When I say what the scariest thing in this game is, I'm not talking about the specimens, the DLCs, or the stories. I'm talking about Howard. I'm not sure what it is about Howard that scares me every time and causes me to literally mute my volume every time I get to his room. Maybe it's the randomness of when he hugs, but it sure doesn't fail to scare me. I remember the first time I was in the foggy maze room, I was very confused because I had my volume very low while in the VC with my friends. Even worse, I was playing the OG version, so it didn't have the ding or donk text like in the HD version, which caused me to get stuck in this room for like a good 5 minutes. Also, I love how the developers of this game just added this phone room as a gag for FNAF. Hello. I've seen people debate if the OG or the HD version of the game is better. I personally think the 2D vibe that the OG version has somehow makes it even creepier. Obviously there are things that the HD does better at, but I think the OG version is just creepier. But the OG version does feel clunky and weird to play, while the HD version is more fun and less buggier to play. And the endless mode in the HD version is just more interesting, which is what we're going to talk about next. I won't be going into every single endless mode specimens because that would be long and unnecessary. However, you can ask what I think about specimens in the comments and I'll reply back, but we're starting off strong with Unknown Specimen 1, also known as Whiteface. This game is literally borrowing Whiteface from the game IMSCARED, which is one of my favorite horror games ever, so when I first saw Whiteface in Endless Mode, I was very pleasantly surprised and also very much spooked. What I also realized is that Whiteface is also a pretty unique specimen, which made me like the specimen even more. First of all, I just love how many references there are to I'm Scared. For example, the walls turning pixelated, the sound that plays when Whiteface spawns, and the death screen where it tells the player that death is no escape. The cutscene after that where it's also a reference to the first ending of I'm Scared, and just the fact that it gives you a chance if you die to a Whiteface is really cool. But one of my pet peeves for Whiteface is that it's a very confusing specimen to get chased by, especially in the OG version. Even after several chases by Whiteface, I'm not exactly sure how he works, but it's still a great specimen regardless. Definitely wish he got nerfed in the OG version though. Unknown Specimen 3, also known as Spooper, is another very interesting specimen. The chase starts with Spooper blocking the door, leaving you with no other choice other than to hit it. And after a few rooms, next thing you know, you're getting poisoned and your health drops slowly and you sometimes throw up, which takes even more of your health. Luckily, in the HD version it's not so bad, but in the OG version, you better hope that the RNG isn't being evil towards you and you throw up every 3 seconds. That aside, it's genuinely a very scary specimen, both terrifying and challenging. You know who else is terrifying and challenging? Unknown Specimen 5, or Lisa, is one of the most terrifying specimens in the entire game. The build-up that this specimen has is pretty intense. It starts off with just silence, and then the rooms get a few different shades of red, while the game is still being silent, and next thing you know, there is another ghost woman that turns invisible when you look away from her. What I said might not sound that terrifying, but I'll never forget the first time I encountered Lisa. It's quite terrifying. I think Monster 5 or the Ghost Cow is one of the best specimens visually. The iron bars, the fog, and whatever stuff is happening on your screen makes it quite interesting, and the music is very well made as well. Sadly, the Ghost Cow isn't mechanically that interesting, but it's very great visually. Anyways, that's all I have to say for this game. I think it's a great horror game. You should definitely try it out. I feel like you'll definitely enjoy the game more if you've played a decent amount of horror games, because this game is like a love letter to all the horror games referenced. Obviously there are more references in this game that I've not mentioned, but I felt like mentioning the ones that I'm more familiar with. I don't know how this game manages to do it, but it's still fun even after 2 years of playing it. I love playing Endless Mode once in a while, and I think the DLCs are very well made. They had quite a good story, gameplay, and since the DLCs are a bit more serious, they're way scarier than the main game. I think the build your own mansion is gonna be quite an interesting feature, and I really look forward to playing it. Thank you for watching the video. I did kinda rush it at the end, but this is also my first video with scripts, and it's quite an experimental one. Let me know if you liked it in the comments.